Hey, good evening, guys. Happy Monday evening. Hope your weekend was great. And welcome to the show. We have a very special show tonight. So we've been talking for months, really, well, probably the last year, about this concept of equity. It's a false concept lately. The concept used to be great in education, right? Is that equity meant is giving children what they needed to be able to access the same opportunity educationally as every other student. Take, for instance, dyslexia. A child understandably would need and should get all the help they needed to be able to access the same educational supports as any other child. Now, what equity means is a couple of things. First, it means prioritizing children or people based on the color of their skin, based on 400-year-old history. And in education, we're also saying that it means equal outcomes. I'm not kidding you. In North Carolina in particular, and the states throughout the union, really, it means that since Black and brown students are not able to have the same test scores or anywhere near the same test scores in some cases, there needs to be an equalization. So how this is showing up in the classroom is that white students are very often and increasingly more scapegoated and collectively punished. Black and brown students are stereotyped and shamed. We keep asking ourselves, is this legal? This can't be legal. What's going on, right? I don't know, but someone that does know is here with us tonight, and I'm going to bring him on right now. Professor Bill Jacobson is with Cornell Law. He started the Legal Insurrection Foundation, Legal Insurrection blog, which, if you have not checked it out, I think it's been going since 2008, right? It's one of the most well-read blogs in the country, and I know that a lot of it's used for show prep everywhere from Mark Levin to Tucker Carlson. Everyone's using this as show prep. And then recently, Professor Jacobson, you've also started criticalracetheory.org, which is a fantastic online clearinghouse of all the colleges throughout the United States. And you kind of do a ranking and a deep dive on how deep these colleges are into critical race theory, so parents can use this as a guide to choose where they're going to send their money and their child. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
So what did you think of my description of equity, how it's being used at this time?
Well, I think that's pretty accurate. The concept equity is not really a word we heard much about 3 years ago. It's incredible how the language can be manipulated towards an end. So equity simply means equal outcomes, I guess, in its most benign form. But what it really means, the way it's used on campuses and social justice movement, is justifying discrimination in order to achieve some end result. And we see that today. The US Supreme Court agreed to hear the Harvard and the UNC cases, which address a fairly open attempt to limit particularly Asian enrollment, Asian American student enrollment, by eliminating or downplaying the SAT or considering other factors. So equity sounds good. I bet if you asked most people on the street, they wouldn't think it's any different than equality. But equality and equity are very different things.
Well, now that you mentioned it, eliminating this SAT score, and I went to Harvard, and I know, how hard I worked. I was an older student, actually, at the time that I went, and had to study for, almost a year to take the SAT as an older student. But I can tell you that it is one of the most colorblind litmus tests that there are. And it really is one of the things that allows an older student who, quite frankly, quit school and went back to school, right? Disadvantaged background like me, or a Black or brown student. So it's one of those things where it's the great unifier. But when you eliminate that, it doesn't only enable folks that haven't traditionally had a chance to have a chance. What it also does is it leaves room for like this college scandal, where now administrators can be paid off since there's no litmus test. Maybe in Lithuania, there's a millionaire with like a burnout son, right? Who doesn't know and doesn't deserve to go to these great schools. But now an administrator can be paid off a few mil and to have the very rich come into these schools. So a lot of times when this happens, it's not giving people a leg up. It's ensuring that the very wealthy and elite stay that way.
Well, that's true. It is about maintaining an elite status, because if you look at students maybe from poorer school districts, and I'm not even talking about inner city school districts, but just around the country where their school districts maybe don't have advanced placement tests, they don't have programs, they don't have those sort of extracurricular things that wealthy districts have. What is the great equalizer? Well, it's the standardized test that allows that student from the middle of America, that student of any race or any ethnicity from middle of America, to show that they are the equal of the students from the suburbs of New York City and DC who attend these fairly tony private schools, or these tony, public schools, but in wealthy districts. So it really is the great equalizer. And I forget who said it. It's not really original to me, but what people don't like is not so much the test itself, it's what the test reveals. And it does reveal that across different demographics and different geographics, there are different results. But the problem isn't the test. The problem is what we're doing in K through 12 to get students ready for college. That's the problem. And so I think doing away with the SAT, minimizing it. Remember, you went to Harvard, I went to Harvard Law School, not undergrad, but Harvard pioneered the way in the 1920s of using so-called soft factors to manipulate ethnicities and demographics. At that point in time, the target was not Asians, it was Jews.
Jews.
They did not like the fact that the percentage of Jews was growing so high based on grades and those other objective factors. And so they started to introduce at Harvard these soft factors, personalities, other sort, so that it gives the admissions officers the chance to manipulate in an unregulated way who gets admission. And lo and behold, once they started doing that, a lot of other schools started doing that. And now that's the sort of soft factors that Asian students are objecting to in the Harvard Law School, that lawsuit that the Supreme Court is taking, is that they had these personality quotients, and they were able to show statistically that Asian applicants had to receive dramatically higher SAT scores to get in, and that they were doing persistently worse on the way the Harvard admissions people measured personality factors. So basically, it's a scheme to maintain the status quo, and a scheme to maintain the admissions offices as in complete control of who gets in, rather than empowering students who do well to gain admission.
Right, which is, again, not only right for racism, which we're seeing, but right for corruption. And we know this. I mean, when you omit these ironclad standards, that's what happens. But people are starting to, I believe, understand, even outside of the parent movement, because we're a year into that, at least here and other places too. People are starting to understand, they did it to Jews. I'm Jewish, you Jew. I mean, we get that. They did it to people of color. They've done it to, I guess, white people are feeling it now. So, it can be a flavor of the month. And so people are starting to say, well, damn, I mean, who's next?
I think the Asian Americans, the Asian students are most directly hit, because if you see what they're doing in New York City to the test required schools, and in Boston and other places where you have elite public schools. I mean, I grew up in the New York City area, Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant. I mean, these were as good as any, $60,000 a year prep school, and you tested to get into them. And it was really a source of pride. And it has been a pathway to success and to admission to the Ivy League and other top schools for poor Asian immigrants. And what happened, just like in DC, I forget the name of that school, at Thomas Jefferson High School, and in Boston at Boston Latin, and in New York at Bronx Science and Stuyvesant and the others, is people, I shouldn't say all people, but some people pushing this woke ideology are upset that the percentage not of whites is getting too high, but of Asians. And it's outright discrimination, but they mask it in different ways.
Yes, absolutely. And this softer stuff. I mean, there's something called social emotional learning, which actually, just like everything else, it has critical race theory and transgenderism embedded into it. But it's the softer side of academics, which means complete BS. There's no academic quality to it whatsoever. And it's a way to strip not only merit, but morality out of the schools. And that's what we're finding.
Yeah, I mean, in Boston, they used, they call it the zip code quota system. They devised a system where they would include in the quotient for admission the zip code you lived in. And it was simply a way of limiting Asian admission to the schools, because that way they got to spread it around, and it had its intended effect. Asian admission to Boston Latin and a couple of the other elite public schools dropped dramatically. So they were successful. Same at Thomas Jefferson. They were successful in lowering the percentage of Asians. And out of some sort of equity, I mean, this is equity. They want, some
Right.
sort of percentage. But there were real people getting hurt by this. I mean, there were students who studied at night, who studied at weekend, who worked their rear ends off to do well on these tests. And they're being told, sorry, because of your ethnicity, we don't want any more of you there. So too bad, because of equity. So equity is not quite as sweet a word as it sounds. It's actually very frequently used as an excuse for discrimination.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's a smoke screen for some pretty nefarious stuff that, really could go either way, depending who you're talking to. Right. And so it's really interesting to me because the same radicals here that are pushing this equity, and they're saying, hey, all teachers are racist, they need this training, etc. But oh, by the way, we want these same teachers to give psychiatric evaluations inside of the classroom and to actually diagnose and treat students.
And the one thing that's just astounding, and I'm sure to you and to many of your listeners or viewers, is how pervasive this is throughout the educational system. From higher ed, which is where it started, but now it's down to kindergarten. It is absolutely everywhere. And it's not just the professors, and it's not just the administrators, it's the book companies, it's the publishers. This whole concept has completely taken over education. And what we're seeing is that it's really harming education. One, you're harming people based on race or ethnicity, which only builds bitterness and recrimination. And also, I was just speaking to a parent yesterday who's in a Boston suburb, well-known suburb, well-regarded suburb. And a lot of the kids, because they're pushing this stuff so heavily, they're not getting taught what they need to get taught.
Right.
And so they're enrolling in for-pay after-school activities, I shouldn't say activities, education, in order to get that advanced education. Because, nowadays they're trying this whole concept of de-leveling. They don't want anybody to excel, because excelling is not equitable. If you excel, then somebody else is lower ranked than you, and they don't want that. It's a completely ridiculous way of approaching things. Education is not a zero-sum game. I'm terrible at math. I've always admitted that. I barely got through high school trigonometry. When I say barely, I mean barely, and I never took a math course again. But I had never had any jealousy of the students in my high school who were good at math. Okay, I was proud of them. We had an award-winning math team. We were all proud of them. But nowadays, you can't be proud of people who excel. You have to be jealous of them, and you have to feel hurt that it's not equitable. Something has gone so deeply wrong at so many levels in our education system, and it's been a generation in the making. It's going to take many years to uproot it.
Well, yes, absolutely. And because you and I have done a lot of work, over the years with BDS, which is the boycott of Israel, and that being inside of the academic system, in higher learning, we kind of know. I mean, well, you're a lawyer, but because I covered BDS for so long, I know a little bit about how hard it is just to fire off a lawsuit of this stuff, right? Because it's, where does the teacher's right to say something end and the student's right begin? And so when you're talking about speech, it's very difficult. So here's how I want to tell you how I'm explaining it to people. And then I want you to add in and tell me where I might be right or wrong or whatever. But, when we look at, let's say, critical race theory, just giving it the garbage can term, let's say it's critical race theory. This can't hurt someone. It may be noxious. It may not be what we want our children reading. We need to ask ourselves, first of all, is it age appropriate? A lot of times, yes. A lot of times, no. So that's the first thing. And we need to also ask, are they just reading about something, or are they operationalizing it? Because let me tell you why I say that. We look at teacher trainings here on a statewide level. Teacher trainings are done and teachers are evaluated on that. They, in many of these trainings, are asked to do something. For instance, do not penalize children of color, right? And stamp out white privilege. To me, that would be actionable, whereas reading something would be offensive, but not necessarily unlawful. Am I on the right track with this?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to focus on the conduct, not the thought process.
Mhm.
So whether it's BDS or it's the umbrella term of CRT, which manifests itself in many different ways, particularly in K through 12. I mean, as you know, you'll never find a third grade book that says critical race theory. That's not how it's done. Okay,
Right.
it's done much more, deceptively than that. But what is the conduct they're doing? Are they making teachers go through a humiliating training which denigrates them based on their race or ethnicity? Is it, what are they doing? Are they having students do things like that? So I think that's really the test that I put through, particularly at the higher ed level. K through 12 is a whole different matter because K through 12 has always been government regulated, the curriculum.
Mhm.
So it's very different. The concepts of academic freedom are not absent in K through 12, but they're much, much weaker than in higher ed. So, state authorities, local authorities have much greater input into what's taught. But I would really look at what are they doing, not just what are they thinking. If a professor, and I think BDS is a perfect example, professor can support BDS. That professors at higher ed academic freedom. They can go to Middle Eastern Studies Association meeting and scream all they want, about anti-Israel stuff. That they're entitled to do that. But when they come to their campus, they cannot discriminate against Jewish students. They cannot discriminate on the basis of national origin, and they have to comply with their university's policies. And I think there's only one or two small colleges in the entire country that embrace BDS as an institution. Most of them have strong statements against it. So you can believe whatever you want. You can say whatever you want. But when you're conducting yourself on the campus, you're subject to the campus's rules. And when you're conducting yourself in K through 12, you're subject to the specified curriculum that the state has approved in state schools.
Okay. And so let me ask you about a recent example that we have here. And I think I sent you this tweet. You may know about it. So we have, to your point, the state paying for teacher training for, get this, disabled preschoolers, that's 3 and 4-year-olds, to decenter their whiteness and deconstruct it in the classroom.
That seems to me, one, completely inappropriate. Put aside whether it violates the law, one, completely inappropriate. I would need to know, has any state official approved this as part of the curriculum, as part of the training for students? But also, even if the state has approved that, these students have a right, I assume in North Carolina, the law is like it is most states, have state anti-discrimination laws. And you cannot discriminate and subject to somebody to that sort of government enforced or government sponsored, vitriol that they seem to be doing. Now, of course, I'm not saying they violated a law. I'd need to know a little more, but it certainly seems to run afoul if you're essentially race shaming 3 and 4-year-olds, which is completely wrong to begin with. It's even more horrible that it's disabled children. And if it's taking place in a state school, it's certainly subject to state anti-discrimination laws. So some people seem to think, oh, we need special laws about critical race theory. Well, no, actually you don't, okay? Your state anti-discrimination laws are probably all you need. You just got to bring the complaint and you've got to push the attorney general to enforce those laws.
So, right, the laws, and that's another thing I wanted to talk to you about. The laws seem to me like they're already on the books, but there's some sort of hesitancy in enforcing those laws. And I'm not talking about just one one uniform, one side of the party and the other. There's a fear maybe on one side, right? And a just meanness and lawlessness on the other side. And we're in a stalemate. So I don't think there's a political solution to this problem necessarily.
Well, I wrote a column a few months ago, I think it was in Real Clear Politics, about the coming divide in education between red states and blue states. That the worst of these practices, I'm a little surprised it's happening in North Carolina, but I guess in many ways you're now a purple state, okay? But this, freedom movement in red states versus this repressive movement at many different levels in blue states. And what you're seeing on these educational issues is just one aspect of that repressive atmosphere. You see it with masking and all those other sort of things. So it's really, just really a question of you're going to have states that have kicked the stuff out of the K through 12 system, like they're entitled to do, and are free educational states, just like they're, free states in many other ways. Then you're going to have deep blue states where it's completely oppressive and where the teachers unions, and every time you can't shake a stick around this stuff without hitting the National Education Association, to a lesser extent, American Federation of Teachers, but really NEA is behind so much of this. Every place we look, we see an NEA affiliate, an NEA marketing company, an NEA communications company. When I say their company, the people who work for them, they produce messaging guides, all sorts of things. NEA is the single biggest problem in this area.
Yes, and a lot of people agree with that. Most people agree with that. So what we're doing as an organization and what we are as a watchdog, and we like to empower activists, give them the tools to go out and do their own watchdogging through FOIAs, et cetera. So we're really focused on what is the government doing, right? Because those elected officials can and should and will be held accountable. What are they spending? What influence do they have? So the educational lobby, which would include NEA and others. So who is signing the contract? And so we do go after NEA. We had the NCAE here in North Carolina. Horrible people, but as you know, I mean, they're kind of entitled to do what they do. I mean, you may not like it, but when you're, to your point, when you're a government official and you're co-signing for government-sponsored racism, that's where the rubber meets the road. So what do you think about putting more pressure on the folks who seek our vote to resist the NEA and others?
Well, it may not be purely a political issue, but the NEA is a good example. How did we make the transition from the NEA, a union, negotiating the terms and conditions of employment, how much you get paid, how much vacation you get, what your pension looks like, to dictating the curriculum?
Oh, I know.
So I don't think that's a traditional role of a union, to dictate the curriculum in public schools. And I think public officials need to address that issue, whether it's by legislation or maybe legislation isn't even needed. But I don't know how we got to the point that NEA is dictating the curriculum in schools. That is not part of the terms and conditions of employment for their members. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. And state officials who are allowing that to happen need to, act against that, because that's not a traditional union thing. Yes, they may have a right to negotiate wages and hours and benefits and all those other things, but they shouldn't be allowed to dictate the curriculum, but that's what they do. In many places, you see NEA members, particularly Rhode Island, on school boards. They get elected because who turns out the vote? NEA basically runs the state of Rhode Island. So that, they're very effective at that. But putting that aside, politics is a big part of it. I mean, look what Glenn Youngkin is doing in Virginia.
Yep.
He won't solve this problem overnight. His first few orders send a message, but one thing we've seen, and I'm sure you see it, is teachers just going rogue. They just do whatever they want. Okay. So this is not a problem that can be solved with one stroke of a pen or one executive order. It's going to take a sustained effort, but politics makes a difference. I mean, look at the difference in Florida. If, Ron DeSantis was not the governor, okay, if it was the guy who ended up being found in a hotel. I forget what his name was.
Oh,
You know who I'm talking about.
yeah, I do. Yeah.
I've
Oh,
already forgotten it. But DeSantis only won Florida by 30 or 40,000 votes. Think how that state would have been different with that other guy who got picked up in the hotel, I think intoxicated or whatever it was.
yeah. I saw the pictures and I'll
Yeah.
never unsee it.
So politics makes a difference. You cannot say it doesn't. And who runs the state? Who runs as a governmental entity, the apparatus? I always say to people that you can protest all you want. You can go to as many school board meetings as you want. But as long as these same people are on the school board, they're just going to they'll outlast you. You got to run for school board. You got to get people to run for school board. You have to take over these mechanisms of government that have been surreptitiously snatched from the public over the course of 10 or 20 years. Nobody was paying attention. All of a sudden, it's 2020, and you wake up and they control everything. And you can protest all you want. And of course, when you protest, they run to the FBI to call you terrorists. But run for school board. Don't just talk about it. People have to do that sort of stuff. You've got to replace these people, get their fingers off the levers of power.
Yes, definitely. And what we're doing is focusing on the state level, because really about 75% of the stuff that's happening is coming from the feds and from our state. For instance, let's say you've got a great board of 8 school board members, you just got them in, et cetera, and you've made the decision in your district, no more CRT, except for the state is now training all the teachers in the state on CRT, and they're evaluating them according to a rubric that would reward that. And of course, it's called equity, don't you know? But that's what we have here going on.
Well, that's right. And that's why I said it's deep. It's at so many levels people cannot imagine, but you've got to start someplace.
Yep.
Don't get the feeling that it's so many places. It's so overwhelming. There's nothing you can do. That's not true. If everybody does something, you will have millions and millions of people around the country doing something, and you'll overwhelm them because study after study, poll after poll, when you fairly describe what this material is. I'm not talking about, push polling or fake polling that,
right.
Should we teach history? Well, of course, everybody's going to say we should teach
or equity.
Or right. Equity, should we? But if it's a fair one, the majority of people are against it and they're voting with their feet. Homeschooling and private schooling is going way up. And the proof that this parents' movement is not racist is where is the single greatest growth in homeschooling? It's among African-American parents pulling their kids out of school because you know what? They want their kids to learn math the right way. They don't want their kids to learn it like they do in California, where you can't say 2 + 2 = 4 because that's racist, or you can't show your proof because that's white supremacy. Parents around the country do not believe this stuff. They don't want this stuff. They want their kids educated, but there are powerful forces at many levels which demonize people, but they're voting with their feet. They're pulling their kids out of the public schools.
Absolutely. No, school choice is a winner. And I have to tell you, the surprising part of our movement when I first started was last December. And the first thing that I came out and said is, look, boys don't belong in the girls' bathroom. I was mobbed by people who liked what I had to say, and they were young Black males who did not have children.
Yeah.
And I asked them, I'm like, guys, I mean, I appreciate that you want to help out, you want to be in this movement, but what's the deal here? And they're like, well, people have not spoken about education in a common sense way in many years in their recent memory. And they do, and a lot of people that don't have children do care about this. And a lot of males, in fact, a lot of ethnic males are very worried about feminization. I know we have a lot of Latino parents who are worried about feminization of males. It's something that it's been going on for years and years, and we can see it with penalizing boys for doing boy things, for instance. I'm not talking about being unruly, and now we can see it just out in the open with encouraging, in a lot of cases, suggesting that kids change their gender, particularly with males.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to touch people in some ways more than the critical race did. mean, critical race set off a firestorm, really created a movement. But I think the gender identity stuff, because it's very clearly trying to rupture the parental-child relationship. It really is a fight over whose children are these. And we see that in the CRT field for sure. But in terms of gender identity, transitioning, actually making physical changes to a minor child without notifying the parents, that really in some ways is more of a volatile issue, because it's going to the heart of what it means to be a parent and what it means to have children. And the question is, are these children of the state, or are
Right.
these your children? And I think that's where the battle, and I think, so while the last year and a half has been all about critical race theory, and it will continue, I think the gender identity and the critical gender theory, not on substance, but on the issue of parental involvement and who gets to decide, I think is going to be another rupture in the system.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's very true. I mean, even if you're, not religious, I know that people, people that believe in God, they feel like it's blasphemous, right? To say that, God makes a mistake in your gender. And that's been a very sore spot. But again, I mean, I think in that argument, politically speaking, I'm not talking about being an opportunist, but there's something for everyone in presenting those facts. They're facts because it is going on. I know that in 10 school districts here in North Carolina, we have what is a hardcore porn in the libraries in middle school. And we're having flagrant, superintendents and school board members say, hey, listen, this is helping gay students, be in touch with themselves. Well, I mean, gay children are not worried about getting porn in a library to be more in touch with themselves. Heteros don't do that. It's absurd.
Yeah, well, there's, a lot of this, whether it's in the quote unquote anti-racism field or this field, it's just perpetuating negative stereotypes. Okay. And you can treat children with respect. You can treat everybody with respect, but how about treating parents with respect also? And how about allowing parents to be involved in this? And, that's the issue. The issue is not the substance. Nobody wants a child who feels, they're gay, who is coming out as gay, to be harassed or anything. We're all against that. But transitioning children, giving them drugs, giving them other things without parents being involved. I mean, you have to get a parent's note to take aspirin at school, but you don't need a parent's note to do puberty blockers or something like that. So it's really not a substantive issue. It's really a parental rights issue. And who controls the children? Is it the parents or is it the school district? When you give your children over to public school, is that where your role ends? And I think the unions and a lot of teachers would say, yes, that's where your role ends. Once they come in our doors, they're ours. Okay. Right. And that is, I'm not exaggerating. You hear them saying these things. They view their role as being activists, and the subject of their activism is your children.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, the age of consent here in North Carolina to be able to consent to treatment for mental health issues specifically is 0. That means, let's take a disabled 4-year-old. They could conceivably, under the statutes, accept treatment for mental health issues. So this is, and now we have psychiatric hospitals basically going into every single school, because now the schools can bill Medicaid for anything. So yeah, I mean, it is the literal, it takes a village. Well, a lot of people don't want a village to raise their child. They want their families. Thank you very much. That way to go for single parents or, intact families.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be a huge political issue in 2022. It was last year in Virginia. I think it's going to be national this time. That the bond between parent and child is being broken in the schools. And that's a very powerful issue. I'm not sure if it's really been framed completely yet, but you do see in many states parents' Bill of Rights, okay, and
right.
Parent rights legislation, and you see other similar things. And I think that's going to be in every certainly congressional election and probably gubernatorial election, maybe state elections, that people are going to have to take a stand. is parental consent needed for various things? Who ultimately controls the children? Is it the school district? Is it the teachers union? Or is it the parents? I don't think Democrats are going to be able to avoid that. And I think a lot of them, to avoid an electoral devastation, are going to have to jump on the bandwagon and agree with the parents' rights movement, because otherwise they're going to get thrown out of office, potentially in historic numbers.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is definitely a winning issue. But lastly, I wanted to talk about, we were talking about this in the green room before you came on, that equity in education. A lot of folks think, hey, I don't have a kid, so I'm not interested. It's not really affecting me. I don't see this in my school. But we have to realize that, look, equity doesn't just apply to education. And oh, by the way, you're going to need a doctor 10 years from now. The doctors coming out of med school 10 years from now are what? I don't know, ninth graders, right? Scary, right? You're going to need that. You're going to need doctors, you're going to need lawyers, things like that. And so you are taking up a case in New York for not only medical freedom, but for outright discrimination. Can you tell us about that? It's a great case.
Sure. One thing I'll say is that, and we've been looking into this very deeply and we'll be coming out with some things. The medical schools are very deeply entrenched in this whole DEI concept. As bad as it is in higher ed and K through 12, in many ways it's worse in medical schools. The American Medical Association is very deeply invested in pushing this stuff. And it's worked its way into the general healthcare system. So in New York State, the New York State Health Commissioner issued a set of guidelines in late December with regard to the distribution of oral monoclonal antibodies. They came out with some new pills that got emergency FDA approval and now are being distributed, but they're in short supply. They're being rationed. And so New York State came out with guidelines on how they were to be handed out. And it's a 5-part test. The first 4 are non-controversial. You have to be over 12. You have to test positive for COVID. You have to have mild to moderate symptoms, and you have to be seeking treatment within 5 days of your symptoms. No problem. Everybody's treated the same. But there's a 5th test. You have to show a personal risk factor that makes you at risk for harm from COVID. If you are, and I'm using the terms they use, if you are non-white or Latino Hispanic, their terms, you automatically pass that 5th step. You do not need to show anything that you have a comorbidity or that you have any health problem. If you don't pass that test, so in other words, if you are white, however they define that, you have to prove something specific to you. So if 2 people walk into a hospital, they all meet those first 4 criteria, but they're 2 people who have no prior health problems. The non-white person gets the pill, the white person doesn't, based solely on race and ethnicity. Outright discrimination. And we filed a lawsuit in federal court in New York State we will be seeking an injunction to halt that racially discriminatory policy.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's, I mean, if you don't, and I applaud you for taking up this case, you're exactly the right man to do this job. Because if you don't, it's going to apply to who gets a heart transplant or who even gets to go into the hospital to be treated anyway. I mean, or for electives or whatever. I mean, even if you can't get a knee surgery for months, it's still a big deal. And so how is rationing healthcare? This is another argument against government-run healthcare.
That's right. And they've taken these principles and they've brought it into the healthcare system. And their rationale their justification, I should say, is that, well, the CDC data shows that a higher percentage of people in minority communities die from COVID. Assuming those statistics are correct, and we don't know if they are or not, but assuming they are correct, what does that mean? That is a group statistic. The fact that the African-American community might have higher rates of diabetes, for argument's sake, which may make somebody more susceptible to COVID, doesn't mean that every African-American has diabetes. And just because, whites, and I hate using that term, but that's the term they use, just because whites might have lower rates of diabetes doesn't mean none of them have it. So the point is, you have to medically care for people based on individuals. And every individual in this country has an individual right to equal protection of the laws and equal treatment. And believe it or not, under Obamacare, it is illegal for someone to discriminate on the basis of race with regard to healthcare. So that's one of the grounds we've sued. Constitutional grounds, anti-discrimination, and Obamacare. Somebody who opposed Obamacare because I felt it would damage the entirety of the system. But it is the law of the land, and that's in there. And they can't do this. And so we're challenging it. But think how pernicious that is. We fret about the nonsense going on in kindergarten, but this is actually now in the healthcare system. This is the delivery. This is literally life and death decisions being made on this concept of equity without regard to individual rights. And if you dig deep into it and you see the ideology of the people behind it, they don't like individual rights. They want group rights. They want rights for each person to be treated as part of an ethnicity or a race or whatever it happens to be, or a gender identity, whatever it happens to be. Individuals are merely parts of groups, whereas our Constitution and the foundation of this country is that individuals have rights. And I have a right, and anybody else has a right to equal protection of the laws as an individual, regardless of what the gross group statistics are with regard to COVID.
Right. And then the same actually that argument would go well inside of the school system, where how dare you say that you're not going to discipline one group, you're going to discipline the other. And, it's just this whole thing of equity. And I can confidently say, looking at day after day at this information, you guys, equity in education, when you hear that, it's almost across the board. Potentially illegal, certainly discriminatory. It's upsetting, but it's the truth.
Yeah, it is. And, the left has a much bigger infrastructure, legal activist infrastructure than the right. And when I say the right, I mean just non-liberals, okay? It doesn't have to be conservative or whatever. But there are so many legal activist groups on the left that anytime the Trump administration would do something, 3 groups were in court the next day. There isn't that infrastructure on the right. It takes days and weeks to find somebody to take a case. And that's a real structural disadvantage that people opposing these have, is that there aren't a lot of groups who have the lawyers on staff to do it. Whereas on the other side, they were falling all over themselves to file lawsuits, and they do it in 5 different districts around the country in the hope that one judge would rule their way. And that's what happened with the initial Trump travel orders.
Right.
We're not a Muslim ban. Okay. They're lying when they say that. They were travel restrictions under his right. They lost some of those. They lost in Massachusetts federal district court, but they won out in Hawaii and a couple of other places. So they would file all over the place, and they only had to win once, whereas the Trump administration had to win every single time.
That's right.
And so,
too.
And that's the strategy that the other side has. And it's, you say correctly, I mean, there should be hundreds of these lawsuits around the country challenging these discriminatory practices, but there aren't, because there just isn't that infrastructure to bring them. And most people can't afford to hire a lawyer. You're not going to spend your life savings objecting to some nonsense being taught in kindergarten, even though it is illegal and even though it's discriminatory. Most people just can't do that, and there aren't enough groups around to do it for them.
Right. Public interest lawyers are, very hard to come by for our side. And then they have the pick of plaintiffs right now, as you mentioned. And it's difficult to do that. But the education infrastructure as well. I mean, we've got one group like ours. There's a think tank that happens to be on our side of the aisle, but one group like ours to 27 well-funded groups on the left. And about half of them have $1.5 million operating budget per year.
The amount of money in terms of building out our database and our website, the amount of money flowing to the people pushing CRT related things in public schools is astounding.
Yeah.
There was just a survey released. It's actually from the summer, but for some reason it just got attention on the volume of donations to Black Lives Matter and quote unquote racial justice groups since George Floyd's death. And I was absolutely floored. I would have estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, 25 billion with a B dollars have been donated by many of the major foundations in the country. I might be a little bit off on the numbers, but the Ford Foundation, I think
Oh,
3.
they're the worst.
All of them. There is so much money flowing to the other side. And of course, what do you hear on CNN and MSNBC? All the dark right-wing money.
Oh, yeah.
There's none of it out there.
No, I don't know where it's going.
As somebody in this field, I wish there was. I always laugh. Please send some of that dark money to me. It doesn't exist. Whereas if I were to flip sides and push CRT, I wouldn't be able to count it fast enough. There is so much institutional and corporate money flowing towards pushing this stuff. It's truly amazing.
Yeah, and the one thing about our organization, we call balls and strikes, and so and I think for that reason, we have just about as many unaffiliated folks that follow us than we do, I guess, conservative affiliated, because we're finding that, you know what, some politicians, they like to get a hold of this money. So we have a Republican superintendent in this state who I believe is the first one in the country that has actually enacted a critical race theory program. And that's the one I mentioned for disabled preschoolers. It's the only Republican in the country who also has her right-hand man married to a lobbyist for CRT products. And so this is when you've got that kind of money in there and you've got that kind of corruption, because I think in every state, the lion's share of the budget goes to education. You've got copious amounts of federal funding coming in, and you've got the Department of Education is the de facto piggy bank for the state. So when you've got that, you guys, you got to always look at your state first, figure out the law, then the policy, and the rule. You need to know who's pulling the levers of those three, how to analyze those, how to attack it. But most often you're going to find a lot of corruption. And when you start going for that corruption up at the state level, you need to be ready for it, because I'll tell you, you'll be attacked hard and you'll be surprised from what side. Because when there's money, you can't predict who's going to be guilty of doing what thing, because that's where, guys, as they always say, follow the money. When you're looking into these things, you've got to follow the money. So definitely. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, I mean, literally every week I read Legal Insurrection at least once or twice a week. Legal Insurrection. Is it .com or org?
.com.
.com. Terrific analyses on the case that you're doing now, other legal issues. You write a lot on critical race theory. Your contributors are top notch. I remember following you guys during the Oberlin case. That was awesome. But any of the legal breakdown, you definitely want to make sure that you hit that up. And are you doing K through 12 analyses now in your?
Well, our database started as higher ed. We have now expanded into elite private schools. Mm-hmm. So we have a database. It's, I think, 60 schools now. We haven't created a database with regard to public schools because, frankly, there's just too many of them. I think there's 13,000 school districts in the country, public school districts. So we really couldn't, from a statistical point of view, couldn't wrap ourselves around it. But in terms of resources, criticalrace.org is the website, has extensive K through 12 resources, articles, links to organizations. I don't recall if you're on there, but please email me. We got to put you on there. You may already be. It's a good resource. So we have the resources for K through 12. We're beginning to do work on it at the regular Legal Insurrection website. So there were a couple of people we brought forward who are now have great national prominence. A mother from South Kingstown, Rhode Island, a teacher from Providence. So we bring people out, we tell their stories, or we let them tell their stories, and hopefully they catch national attention and become leaders in the field. And so we do a lot on K through 12, but we don't have the database because we haven't figured out a way to do it because it's just such a massive undertaking. We'd have to hire 100 people, and the Ford Foundation is not going to send us $1 billion to do that. So I don't think we can do that.
They're definitely. You're talking about Nicole Solis?
Nicole Solis from South Kingstown and Ramona Bessinger, the Providence middle school teacher, who talked about the pernicious impact of the change of curriculum and how the students who are close to 100% minority started calling her America because she's America because she's white. They're not America because they're not white. It shows you how this curriculum is really, that's kind of what it's about. It's about turning kids against the country. And so we told her story and we told Nicole's, and now they're both national figures. And, you know, hopefully we'll find more people to bring forward.
Definitely. Well, thank you again for everything that you're doing to help us here on the ground. Thank you for this interview. Guys, you have to check out the blog, and we will see you later on this week. Thank you.